Hi, and welcome back for Module 6. We are going to keep talking about the Love It, Like It, Learning It frameworks in the context of how to leverage those Love It foods to hopefully branch out and include some new variations of Love It foods that might fall in that category of Like It foods. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in. So first I want to go ahead and start out by making sure that you've had an opportunity to complete your qualifiers list. As we talked about in Module 5, we want to make sure that you have a list not only of your child's Love It, Like It, and Learning It foods, but also what qualifies as your child's Love It foods. So as discussed from the resource, Anxious Eaters, Anxious Mealtimes, we want to make sure that you have as thorough of an understanding as possible of kind of what parentheses or what conditions or characteristics your child's Love It foods have and also fall under when we look at the more complete list of the qualifiers by category. So if you haven't already done so, please make sure to stop the module and go ahead and do this homework from Module 5 so that you will best be able to move forward with the content that we're covering in Module 6. To tie this into where we left things off from Module 5, we are going to see how these qualifiers on the homework that you did, in fact, helps us to prevent food jags through a method known as food chaining. So ideally, one of the most surefire ways to prevent food jags, as we talked about, from perpetuating some of the long-term problems that we also discussed in Module 5, is for us to work through how we can begin to expand your child's Love It list so that you're able to change up the foods that you offer on a day-to-day basis. Again, this slide should be familiar from Module 5, so I'm not going to go through it in too much depth here, but I want you to take a look at how we go about this long-term aim through these short-term action steps. As mentioned, we're going to find the qualifiers, which hopefully you already have done in the homework, and then we're going to begin to expand upon these using the information we know about what characteristics your child does prefer in the foods that they eat regularly and enjoy. With this, it's going to help us leverage those Love It foods that we know that they already have to hopefully identify and discover some new Like It foods that are most likely to be the next foods that they would be most likely to enjoy in addition to those that they already have. This approach informally is what we refer to as food chaining, and making chains between the foods that we know a child likes and enjoys and those that offer more variety to the diet and ultimately help us achieve greater nutritional density with the foods that your child accepts. So let's go ahead and review what is food chaining. If you have followed me or others in the pediatric feeding space for any amount of time, chances are you have either heard us talk about this topic a time or two or seen examples of this shared on our Instagram feeds and things like that. And that's because this is a highly effective way to get our child to accept new foods in a gradual, non-threatening way that can be used in conjunction with the division of responsibility. That means using a method that is consistent with food parenting practices that we've already spent so much time discussing throughout the Academy. Food chaining is a method that helps you as the parent to take the next step to introduce foods to your child that they will most likely be successful with. This is based on recognizing the features your child already tolerates and then offering more foods with those features. We can think about this in terms of the homework that you just did. When you look at what qualifiers your child seem to enjoy or gravitate to, we are going to then think of what's the next most likely food that might reflect similar qualifiers or similar characteristics to those foods that we know your child already eats, enjoys, and ultimately accepts. So how does food chaining work? Well, an excellent resource that some of you may already know about or have seen in the suggested resources for Module 6 is a book by several different authors in the feeding space, one of which being Sherry Fraker. And it's the book called Food Chaining, the Proven 6-Step Plan to Stop Picky Eating, Solve Feeding Problems, and Expand Your Child's Diet. And if food chaining is something that you'd like a lot more in-depth information on, I encourage you to check this resource out. But in short, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through what food chaining is, as well as how it works and how it might work for you so that we can begin to, again, take some short-term action steps to get to that long-term aim of offering more variety. So food chaining is based on the notion that your child eats what they like. That seems pretty basic to all of us. I'm sure all of us could understand that pretty quickly based off looking at our child's qualifier list and the amount of specificity. Again, some kids will have more specificity and others will have less specificity in terms of how many qualifiers they have for their given Love It foods. But food chaining, regardless of how specific kids are with the number of qualifiers they have for the foods on their Love It list, Food chaining is going to allow families to build upon what a child's natural preferences are for the foods that they eat. This also is going to leverage any past successful eating experiences that a family might know worked for their child. Food chaining helps us lay a pathway and a blueprint, so to speak, of kind of a direction to go to help your child leverage the foods that they already eat and that they already enjoy in a way that exposes them to other foods that are the same or maybe have similar feature to those Love It foods that they already eat. So some of the commonalities between the foods that your child already loves and those that they might be inclined to eat might be things like taste, texture, temperature, or consistency. And food chaining can also help us, as mentioned in Module 5, look at how we might be able to add back lost Love It foods, because typically the foods that your child at one point loved and maybe now doesn't love quite as much, or has kind of moved all the way back to learning to like it still, tend to be some of those that they might be most inclined to add back first. So food chaining can help us add back some of those foods so that, again, we continue to make a more robust Love It list using that information we know about your child in terms of what foods they're most likely to be successful with next. So at this point, hopefully you're starting to get a little excited because you see there's potential. There's potential whether your child has 5 items on their Love It list or whether they already have 30, and you know that you have some variety, just not as much variety as maybe you want. What you can do is start making subtle changes to the foods that are on your child's Love It list. Again, you know the characteristics of those foods. You know what makes that food qualify as a Love It food, and all those idiosyncrasies that play into why your child enjoys that food and in what form they enjoy that food. So where you start with food chaining is to begin to make changes that are large enough to be noticed, but small enough that your child won't care. This is highly individualized. Some kids are going to notice the smallest change and really care about it, which tells you you have to make an even smaller change than you thought you already did. Oftentimes as parents, we want to make strides in feeding our kids. We have some ideals and expectations in our head of how we want them to eat, and we're ready to go after them. But with that, we make too big of leaps, and our kids are just not ready to get there yet. So something that we're going to show you as we work through how to start with food chaining and how to grow with it is how to get there depending on how slow you need to go. But the main goal is you want to think, how do I make some subtle change that is large enough to notice but small enough that my child won't care? Again, you know your child's feeding temperament. You know how many qualifiers they have on their Love It foods. If they're a child that every food has several qualifiers, you know that the number of changes you're going to be able to make or the how drastic of a change you're going to be able to make is probably going to start out much smaller, where if some child has much fewer qualifiers, they may be able to handle larger changes being made to their preferred foods. So keep that in mind as you get started. Then with that, I want you to think through how can you begin to choose 2 to 3 Love It foods that you target first. I want you to think about a few important things here, one of which being do not choose your child's most important source of nutrition. If you know that your child eats full-fat yogurt every day and it's a substantial amount of nutrition and calories for them, please do not start with yogurt. That's a great food to food chain. That is probably not the best one to start with because, again, as we talked about in Module 5, if your child sees that there's a surprise in a Love It food, if there is a change made to their Love It food that they do not tolerate, they may lose the food altogether. So I don't want to say that to worry you or to make you feel any more like you're walking on eggshells, but I do want to say that in a way that gives you a little bit of a precaution in terms of why you might start with the less nutritionally dense foods. So it might be a preferred cracker. Again, it has a place nutritionally. It's offering some bit of nutrition, even if it's just in the form of calories alone, but it's not the greatest source of nutrition in their diet. So I would start with one that you're relying on less for their nutrition and begin there. And so say we're talking about goldfish here, you can start with that and you can begin to see what would be a change that would be large enough for my child to notice but small enough that they wouldn't care. And I want you to go ahead and start with 2 to 3 of these. Again, because if your child only has, say, 5 to 10 Love It foods right now, you need to start small and see and understand your child and observe how your child responds to this before you too ambitiously go after all the Love It foods and then could kind of put yourself in a challenging position if your child, maybe you make too big of changes or too big of strides and your child doesn't respond. So start with a couple so that you can kind of start to learn how your child responds. And again, this is going to be specific to each child, but also specific to each food. If it's a food that they have a lot of qualifiers for, you might need to make smaller steps. If it's a food that they have few qualifiers for, you can probably make a few bigger assumptions with food chaining that they might be able to tolerate. But I want you to do is offer a slightly modified version of these foods one time a day. So say right now, as mentioned as an example in Module 5, let's stick to bananas at breakfast. Say your child eats a banana every morning the exact same way. Initially, your change might be really small, but in order to get to that long-term aim of not offering the same food every day, it might just be a small, subtle change right now that makes it quote unquote different from day to day. So say on Monday, it's whatever the preferred way of offering the banana is right now. And then on Tuesday, try a slightly modified version of that banana. And you'll see in the coming slides and then throughout this module how we begin to build on that to get some real variety long term. For an example of some food chaining, you can see some of the examples I've shared through my combination cards. I know some of you already own my combination cards either digitally or in the printed version, but you can see here for the example of waffles. And on the front side of each card, for the breakfast deck, which this comes from, would be an example of how to offer waffles if it's a love it, a like it, or a learning it food. But one of the reasons I created these combination cards is because if your child loves waffles, we don't want you offering waffles the exact same way, the exact same brand, the exact same style every single time. And so one of the ways that you can food chain it is to think of different variations of waffle that your child might accept. Here you can see some are more subtle changes and some are much bigger, more bold changes. So something like changing the shape of the waffle into making it look like a waffle cone instead of maybe the standard straight out of the toaster circle shape would be a more subtle change. Usually if we change the shape or the color, those are the two that the child might respond to the least amount. But again, as we talked about in Module 5, shape and color can also apply to packaging, which we'll touch on later. But in this example, I want to just go ahead and show you a few different examples of how you might switch it up. Again, this would not be each link in the chain to these changes for something like, let's say, an egg that's made in a waffle iron. This is obviously has a lot more changes. There's textural change, but there's also been changes to the taste and the color, and there's more than just one single change being made at this given time. But I wanted to show you an example so you could kind of see visually how this can look and some examples of kind of like where long-term these food chains can help get you. So what is important for you to understand here is that food chaining can move in many different directions. As shared in the suggested resource that I already mentioned, food chaining can move in many different directions based on how your child either accepts or rejects new foods and grows more tolerance to new tastes and textures. If you have that understanding coming into this process and you expect from food chaining for it to be not a linear process, but rather a very customized process based off how your child responds, your expectations will be much more appropriately set for what to expect out of food chaining. Again, it is a slow process. Oftentimes we want to make strides. We want to go from toaster waffle to eggs cooked in a waffle iron. That's a pretty big step. But if you see all the small steps, or rather the links in a food chain that help contribute to those small gradual changes, you can see how you can leverage some of the characteristics that your child already tolerates and eats and enjoys into leveraging it into new foods. However, as you go about this, you might start, and I'll stick with the example of waffles here, but you might start the process and think, I'm going to change the shape and I'm going to cut it into the waffle ice cream cone shape. And you might see that your child responds really well, and you get to start exposing them to the bananas, and then they're really into the chia seeds that you put on it, and they tried whipped cream and a cherry on top, for the first time. And again, that would be pretty great outcome in response to the process if none of those other foods except for the waffle were preferred. But you can see that if that was the pace that your child was setting and they were much more receptive to all the other foods that it was served with, and that was a direction that they took to, you would want to respond with tailoring your food chain in that direction to some of those foods that you see them already starting to respond well to, rather than having kind of a specific blueprint in your head of, I need to move in the direction of, I need my kid to eat eggs, not just more types of waffles, so I'm going to move towards, you know, making this waffle iron egg, and then your child completely rejects it, or the pace is very slow, or it's just not a direction that your child shows that they're receptive to going to. So if you can understand that this is not a rigid food plan, it's not a prescription of what your child should do, but it's one that's intended to help give you a map and some guidance towards some next potential landmarks that your child might come upon based off the foods that they're already eating, that will ultimately expand your child's Love It list to provide more variety and ultimately more nutritional density through any of the directions that they choose to take it.